The moment I placed the pendant on the great stone table, the entire hall went silent. Not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole, the kind that makes your pulse loud in your own ears and turns every breath into a confession. 43 wolves staring at me, a girl who had no business being in that hall at all, holding something that belonged to the most feared Alpha King in the Northern Territories. I had found it 3 days ago, half buried in the mud near the eastern ridge where the river bends sharp and cold. I didn't know what it was at first, just a disk of darkened silver, carved with a pattern so intricate it seemed to breathe when the light hit it right. Old. Older than anything I had ever touched. My fingers had closed around it instinctively, the metal warming against my palm faster than it should have, and something at the base of my throat had tightened. My name is Nora. I am 23 years old, an Omega in the Greywood Pack, which is another way of saying I am no one important. I carry firewood. I help the healers mix remedies. I keep my eyes low and my footsteps quiet, because that is what the world has asked of me since I was old enough to understand what the word Omega truly meant in the hierarchy of our kind. It meant last, always last. The hall of Greywood's main lodge smelled of pine resin and tallow candles and the faint iron-edged musk of dominant wolves who hadn't been challenged in years. Stone walls rose on all sides, hung with faded banners I had only ever seen from the outside, pressing my face against the window glass on winter mornings when the council met, and the lodge glowed amber and warm. I had never been invited inside. Today, I had invited myself. Beta Calder had tried to stop me at the door. He was a wide man with a jaw like an anvil and a voice built for commands, and he had placed one heavy hand on the door frame and looked at me the way people look at something they've nearly stepped on. Omegas don't attend council meetings, girl. I know, I said. I'm not attending. I'm returning something. He hadn't moved. I had stood there with my spine straight and my chin level, the pendant wrapped in a cloth inside my cloak pocket, its warmth pressing against my ribs like a second heartbeat. I had rehearsed this moment for 3 nights, lying on my narrow cot, while the wind carved under the door, telling myself I would be calm. I was not calm, but I was there. Eventually, Calder stepped aside, not because he respected me, but because the pendant's silver edge had shifted the cloth slightly, and he caught a glimpse of the carving. His face changed. Something almost like fear moved behind his eyes. That had told me everything I needed to know about what I was carrying. Now I stood at the long table, and they all stared, and I kept my hands flat against the stone so no one would see them shake. The Council of Greywood was a ring of powerful wolves, Calder, Beta, and Enforcer. Seraphine, head healer, and the only woman in the room whose presence commanded silence on its own terms. A tall woman in her 50s with silver-threaded hair and dark, measuring eyes. Old Fen, who tracked territories and knew every border treaty signed in the last century, and 4-pack alphas from the surrounding regions, men who smelled of forest and old authority. At the head of the table, the chair was empty. That was the first strange thing. The chair where Alpha King Orion was meant to sit stood empty and unclaimed, as though even furniture understood better than to occupy that space uninvited. The second strange thing was the map spread across the entire surface of the table, covered in markings I couldn't read. Territorial lines redrawn in red, routes circled, locations starred. Something had been happening in these lands. Something that had everyone in this room tense, in a way that went beyond the ordinary pressures of politics. Seraphine was the first to speak. "Where did you find it?" Her voice was low and careful. "Eastern Ridge," I said. "Near the river bend. It was in the mud, just below the surface. 3 days ago, at dawn." A sound ran around the room. Not quite words, more like a collective exhale that carried several different emotions at once. Fen pressed both his weathered hands flat on the table and stared at the pendant as though it might move. Calder's voice came from behind me. "You're certain it was there? No one handed it to you? No one from another pack?" I turned to face him. I live alone in the Omega quarters on the northern edge of camp. I don't receive visitors. That was perhaps more honest than I had intended. A flicker of something. Not quite pity, but adjacent to it. Crossed Seraphine's face. She reached for the pendant, then stopped, her fingers hovering just above the cloth. Only the king can touch it, Old Fen said quietly. That's the law. I've already touched it, I said. For 3 days. The silence that followed was different from the first one. This silence had texture. It pressed against my skin and asked questions I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't sure what I had expected. Gratitude, perhaps. Or at least a brisk dismissal, and maybe a token acknowledgement that I had done something decent. What I had not expected was the way Seraphine's gaze moved from the pendant to me, and then stayed there, studying me the way she studied unusual herbs brought in from unknown territories. Sit down, she said finally. Sit down, Nora. The fact that she knew my name startled me more than anything else in that room. I pulled out the nearest chair, one meant for pack alphas, made of dark oak and carved with territorial symbols, and sat and folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Old Fen cleared his throat. The king has been looking for this for 11 days. 11 days. I had found it 3 days ago, which meant it had been missing for 8 days before I pulled it from the mud. 8 days during which the Alpha King of the Northern Territories had been without whatever this pendant meant to him, and no one at this table had told me yet what that actually was. What is it? I asked. No one answered immediately. The candles on the iron chandelier above us guttered in a draft from somewhere, throwing shadows that moved like living things across the stone walls. Then the main door opened. Not slowly, not politely. It opened the way storms arrive, all at once, with the full weight of inevitability behind it. He was exactly what the stories had made him. Tall in a way that reorganized how you understood a room. Dark-haired with braids worn back from a face that was all sharp edges and unreadable stillness. He wore leather and fur, practical and unadorned, but carried himself with the kind of authority that needed no decoration. His eyes were pale, startlingly, almost colorlessly pale, and when they swept the room in the first half-second after he entered, they missed nothing. They stopped on me. Not on the pendant, not on the map, not on the council members who had risen to their feet around the table. On me. I did not look away. I'm not entirely sure why. Every instinct I had been trained to follow said, lower your gaze, make yourself small, become invisible. But something held my chin level and my eyes steady, and for 3 full seconds, Alpha King Orion looked at an Omega from the Greywood pack who had no business sitting in his council chair. Then his gaze dropped to the pendant on the table, and the expression that crossed his face, just for a moment, just a fracture in the stone, was something I would spend the next several weeks trying to name. He crossed the room in silence. Not the silence of someone trying to be quiet. The silence of someone who had never needed to announce himself, because every space he entered already knew he was coming. The other wolves in the room shifted almost imperceptibly as he moved past them, shoulders angling inward, chins dropping a fraction, the involuntary language of submission written into the bodies of powerful men who would never admit to feeling it. I stayed still, partly because I didn't know what else to do, partly because my legs had decided, somewhere between his entrance and his crossing the room, that they were no longer reliable, and partly because there was something in the way he moved that made stillness feel like the only appropriate response. The way you go quiet in a forest when something ancient passes through it. Orion stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at the pendant for a long moment without touching it. Then he looked at me again. And this time the look lasted longer, and it had more layers to it. You found it, he said. His voice was lower than I expected. Not soft. Nothing about him was soft, but measured, deliberate. The voice of someone who had learned at some cost to choose words carefully. Yes, I said. At the eastern ridge, near the river bend. 3 days ago. It wasn't a question. Someone had already told him, or he simply knew, the way alphas sometimes knew things about their territory that no report had carried to them yet. Yes. And you carried it for 3 days before bringing it here. There was no accusation in it, just the flat observation of a fact, laid between us like something he intended to examine later. I felt the weight of it anyway. I needed to be certain of what it was, I said. I didn't want to bring something ordinary to the council and waste their time. Seraphine made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a cough. Old Fen studied the map with sudden intense interest. Orion's pale eyes didn't move from mine. And when you were certain? I came immediately. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, and perhaps not ever, but a recalibration of some kind. The way a scale adjusts when the weight placed on it is different from what was anticipated. He reached out and picked up the pendant. The moment his fingers closed around it, the room exhaled. Every person at that table released something they had been holding without knowing it. Even the candles seemed to steady. The pendant disappeared into his closed fist, and he stood there for a moment with his head slightly bowed and his eyes closed, and I had the distinct sense that I was witnessing something private, something I should probably look away from. I didn't. When he opened his eyes, he looked directly at me again, and this time there was a question in his gaze that he hadn't yet decided to ask aloud. They sent me out of the room after that. Calder escorted me to the corridor with a hand near my elbow that never quite touched me, as though contact might be interpreted as acknowledgement, and told me to wait. The door closed. I stood alone in the stone passage with its single narrow window overlooking the training yard, where a group of young wolves were running formations in the gray morning light, their breath clouding the air in white bursts. I had expected to be dismissed, thanked briefly, given perhaps a small formal acknowledgement, and sent back to the Omega quarters to continue being invisible in the usual ways. That was the logical outcome. That was the outcome the world had been rehearsing me for. Instead, I waited in the corridor for 40 minutes. I counted them by the movements in the training yard. 3 rotation changes, 2 water breaks, 1 argument between 2 younger wolves that their supervisor ended with a single sharp word. My feet ached. The stone floor was cold even through my boots. I pressed my back against the wall and told myself the waiting meant nothing, that they had simply forgotten I was there. That any moment now Calder would emerge and gesture me toward the exit with the polite indifference of someone disposing of something mildly inconvenient. The door opened, and Seraphine came out instead. She looked at me for a moment, and I had the sense she was completing some internal assessment she had begun in the council room. "Come with me," she said. Her workroom was nothing like the council hall. Where that space was formal and heavy with authority, Seraphine's room was dense with life. Bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, jars of tinctures lined along shelves in order of color and viscosity, maps of different kinds pinned to a corkboard near the window. These ones marked not with territorial boundaries, but with migration patterns and seasonal routes and small notations in a handwriting so precise it looked almost mechanical. She poured 2 cups of something that steamed and smelled of pine and cloves, and handed one to me without ceremony, and sat across the low table and looked at me the way she had looked at the pendant. "How long have you been Omega in this pack?" she asked. 4 years, I said. I came from the Ashvale territory after their dissolution. She nodded as though this confirmed something. And before that? My family was independent. We didn't belong to a pack. I paused. That's not uncommon for Omegas. No, she agreed. It isn't. She wrapped both hands around her cup. You held the pendant for 3 days, Nora. Most wolves who aren't the king can't hold it for 3 hours without feeling the effects. I looked at her. What effects? Disorientation, fever, a kind of pressure behind the eyes that builds until you have to put it down. She tilted her head slightly. You felt none of that? I thought about the 3 days. the warmth against my ribs, constant and even. The way I had slept better than usual those nights, dreamlessly and deeply. The strange clarity I had felt in the mornings, as though something had been cleaning the fog from the edges of my thoughts. "No," I said slowly. "None of that." Seraphine set her cup down. "The pendant is a binding object. It was made for the Alpha King's line, specifically to respond to the blood and the will of whoever carries that lineage. For anyone outside that line to hold it comfortably, for days without consequence." She stopped. "It isn't supposed to be possible." I sat with that for a moment. "I'm an Omega from a dissolved pack," I said. "I carry firewood and mix healing remedies." "I know what you do here." She said it without unkindness. "I also know that isn't all you are." She picked her cup up again. "The king has asked to speak with you, this afternoon in the main study. I told him I would prepare you." "Prepare me for what?" She smiled, and it was a complicated smile, layered with things I couldn't fully read. "For the fact that your life is about to become considerably more complicated." I walked back to the Omega quarters in a state somewhere between numb and alert, the kind of suspended clarity that arrives after a shock has passed through the body, and the mind is still deciding what to feel about it. The morning had turned overcast, the sky pressing low and pale over the lodge rooftops, and the smell of coming rain moved through the camp in slow, rolling waves. My quarters were a single room at the northern edge of the residential block. Practical, sparse, mine. A narrow bed, a trunk for clothing, a small shelf where I kept 3 books I had traded work for over the years, and a window that looked out over the tree line into the dark beginning of the forest. I had always found the view steadying. The forest didn't care about hierarchy. The forest simply was. I sat on the edge of my bed and pressed my palm flat against my knee and breathed. The pendant had felt like a heartbeat. For 3 days it had felt like a second heartbeat, calm and steady, just beneath the surface of my own. And I had genuinely believed that it was just a strange object, old and powerful in the abstract way that old things sometimes are, and that returning it would close the story neatly and deposit me back into my ordinary life. Outside my window, the first drops of rain began to fall through the pine branches, dark and quiet. I thought about pale eyes that had stopped on my face before they found the thing they were looking for. I thought about Seraphine's voice saying, "That isn't all you are." The afternoon felt very far away and very close at the same time. The main study smelled of old leather and wood smoke, and something underneath both of those things. Something darker and earthier that I couldn't name, but that settled in my chest the moment I stepped through the door, like a frequency my body recognized before my mind did. Orion was standing at the window when I entered. He had his back to the room, one hand braced against the stone frame, looking out over the same overcast sky I had been watching from my quarters. From this angle, with the gray light falling across his shoulders and the dark braids loose against his neck, he looked less like the figure from the stories, the undefeated king, the Northern Terror, the wolf no alpha had challenged twice, and more like someone who had been standing at windows for a very long time, looking at things that weren't quite there anymore. Calder stood to the left of the door. He didn't acknowledge me when I came in. Old Fen sat in the corner with a ledger open in his lap, but his eyes weren't on the page. "Close the door," Orion said, without turning. I closed it. "Sit, if you want." There were 2 chairs near the fireplace, low and worn, the kind of furniture that had been used for actual sitting rather than display. I chose the one farther from the fire because the room was already warm, and because some instinct suggested I should leave the closer chair available. I sat. I folded my hands. I waited. He turned from the window after another moment, and I had the impression he had been using those final seconds to compose something, not his expression, which remained still and unreadable as before, but something interior, something he was choosing how to carry into the room. He crossed to the other chair and sat, and for a moment, he simply looked at me, and the firelight moved across his features and found the lines there. Not age, exactly, but weight. The particular weight of someone who has made decisions that cost more than they had budgeted for. "Seraphine tells me you had no reaction to carrying the pendant," he said. "She told me the same thing was unusual. It's more than unusual." He held my gaze steadily. "In 4 generations of my family's line, only those with direct blood connection to the original binding have been able to hold it without consequence. That is 3 people, all of them dead." A brief pause. "And now you." I didn't know what to say to that. I said what was true. "I don't understand what that means." "Neither do I yet." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the posture made him look unexpectedly human. Not the Alpha King performing authority, but a man confronting a problem he hadn't anticipated. "Tell me about your family." So I told him. It wasn't a long story, or a remarkable one, not the way stories in that room usually went. My parents had been independent wolves, unaffiliated, moving between territories as work and season allowed. My father had been a craftsman, my mother a healer's assistant. They had both passed when I was 17, within the same winter of each other. And I had been alone since then, drifting between packs, taking work where I could find it, landing finally in Greywood because it was large enough that one more quiet Omega went unnoticed. Orion listened without interrupting. He was very good at listening, the kind of listener who makes no sound at all and watches your face rather than the middle distance, so that you become aware of each word as you release it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your mother," he said. "Her name." "Eyeless," I said. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the fire. Old Fen in his corner had stopped pretending to read. Calder's posture near the door had shifted. The anvil jaw tightened, the arms crossed, something that might have been discomfort moving behind his eyes. "There was a woman named Eyeless," Orion said carefully, "who served as a healer in the court of my father's pack 30 years ago. She left abruptly, without formal notice. It was noted at the time because she had access to certain restricted archives, including the archive where the binding records are kept." The fire popped softly. Rain moved against the window glass in slow, irregular patterns. "You're saying my mother was in your father's court," I said. "I'm saying it's possible." He looked at me again. "I'm saying the coincidence of your name, your lineage, and your capacity to hold that pendant without harm is the kind of coincidence I've learned not to trust." I sat with it. I turned it over the way you turn a stone over, not certain what's underneath, but knowing the turning is necessary. "What was in the binding records?" I asked. Another pause. This one had texture to it, a decision being made somewhere inside him, about how much to say to a woman who was still, formally, an Omega from a minor pack, with no standing in his court. "Proof," he said finally, "that my line is not the only one capable of carrying the pendant's bond." The days that followed moved strangely. I was not sent back to my ordinary duties. No one formally told me this. No announcement was made. No status was changed. But when I arrived at the firewood station the morning after my meeting with Orion, the senior Omega in charge of work assignments gave me an odd look and said there had been a schedule adjustment, and that I was to report to Seraphine's workroom instead. Seraphine put me to work immediately, with the practical efficiency of someone who had no patience for uncertainty. She handed me a bundle of greywood bark and told me to strip and sort it, and while I worked, she talked about the pack's history, about the territories, about the slow territorial pressures from the southern groups that had been building for years and that the council had been discussing in increasingly strained tones. She didn't talk about the pendant. She didn't talk about Orion. But she asked me questions, woven into the conversation so naturally that I only noticed them afterward, about what plants I knew, what remedies my mother had taught me, what I had learned during my years between packs. I answered honestly. I always answered honestly. It was one of the few habits I had managed to keep intact through everything that had tried to strip it from me. On the 3rd day, Seraphine handed me a key. It was small and iron, unremarkable except for the weight of it. "The East Archive," she said, as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing to say. "Third shelf, left side. There's a ledger with a green cover. Bring it to me." I looked at her. "Am I allowed in the East Archive?" She met my gaze without blinking. "You are now." The archive was a long, narrow room carved into the bedrock beneath the lodge, reached by a staircase that smelled of stone and time and the cold particular to underground places where the seasons don't reach. Lamps burned at intervals along the walls, low and amber, throwing more shadow than light. I found the third shelf on the left. The green ledger was there, old, its spine cracked with use, the cover faded to something closer to gray-green than true green. I pulled it out carefully, the way I had been taught to handle old things. It came loose from the shelf with a faint sound, like a breath released. I should have simply carried it back up the stairs. Instead, I stood in the amber lamplight and opened the first page. The handwriting inside was precise and small, and immediately, unmistakably familiar. The same careful loops and deliberate spacing I had grown up watching form letters on scraps of paper in a cold kitchen, writing out remedies and lists, and occasionally, when she thought I was asleep, things that were neither. My mother's handwriting. I stood very still in the underground cold, the ledger open in my hands, and read the first line. "If you are reading this, then the pendant has already found you, which means there is no longer any point in keeping the rest hidden." Outside, somewhere far above me, the rain had stopped. The silence that replaced it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I read the ledger twice standing there in the cold, and then I carried it upstairs and sat down on the bottom step of the staircase because my legs had made their decision again, and this time I didn't argue with them. My mother had written 31 pages in that small, careful hand. Not a journal. Not exactly. More like a document assembled with the deliberateness of someone who knows they may not be present to explain it in person. Dates, names, observations. The clinical precision of a healer's notes wrapped around something that was anything but clinical. She had been in the court of Orion's father for 2 years. She had worked in the healing wing, and she had been good at her work, and she had been trusted enough to be given access to the restricted archive where the binding records were kept. She had read those records, all of them, and what she had found there had frightened her enough to leave without saying goodbye to anyone. The binding, she had written, was not a simple royal artifact. It was older than the current king's line by several generations, old enough that the original maker's name had been worn off the record through recopying. What remained was this. The pendant had been created as a peace object, a bridge between two lines that had been in conflict for so long that the conflict itself had become structural, woven into the way both lines understood themselves. The binding was meant to be held by both, not one or the other. Two people, two bloodlines. The pendant would recognize them both, respond to them both, and the holding of it together was supposed to seal something that words and treaties had failed to seal for generations. But somewhere in the intervening years, the second bloodline had been declared extinct. My mother had not believed this. "I have seen the secondary record," she had written, the one kept separately from the main archive, the one that was meant to be destroyed but wasn't, because the archivist at the time was too careful and perhaps too honest to burn something true just because it was inconvenient. The second line did not end. It dispersed. It went quiet. It learned, as subordinated things often do, to survive by becoming invisible. I read that line 3 times. Becoming invisible. I thought about 4 years of carrying firewood. I thought about lowered eyes and quiet footsteps, and the particular skill of moving through spaces without being remembered. I thought about how thoroughly I had learned it, how it had felt at times, less like survival and more like disappearance. I stood up. I carried the ledger to Seraphine. She was waiting for me. Not with surprise, with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting and knows the waiting is almost over. She took the ledger from my hands and set it on the table between us, and looked at it for a moment before she looked at me. You read it, she said. Yes. All of it? All of it. She nodded slowly. How do you feel? It was such a simple question for such a complicated answer. I sat down across from her and pressed my hands flat on my thighs and thought about it honestly. Because she deserved honesty. And because I was tired. Suddenly, bone-deeply tired. Of answers that weren't quite true. Like something I built very carefully is coming apart, I said. And I'm not sure yet whether what's underneath it is better or worse. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Then, your mother came to me, before she left. Not to tell me everything. She was too careful for that. But she left something with me. A sealed letter, with instructions that it was only to be opened if someone from her line arrived at this pack carrying the pendant without harm. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and placed a small envelope on the table. Folded paper, sealed with plain wax, the seal unbroken. My name was written on the front. Not in Seraphine's hand, in my mother's. I stared at it for a long time. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere in the lodge above us, voices moved through the corridors, the ordinary sounds of the pack's daily life continuing without pause or ceremony, indifferent to the fact that the floor of my world was rearranging itself. I picked up the envelope and broke the seal. The letter inside was short. 7 lines. My mother had always believed that the most important things could be said briefly, and that anything longer was usually fear padding itself out. Nora, if you are reading this, you found your way to where you were always going to end up. I am sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. I am sorry for a great many things, most of which I hope you will eventually understand. The pendant will have already told you more than I can put in words. Trust what it made you feel, not what the world told you to feel about yourself. You were never last. You were never invisible. You were kept safe. And there is a difference. The king's line and ours were never meant to be in opposition. Remember that, when it matters. It will matter soon. Your mother. I folded the letter. I put it in my pocket. I kept my face very still. Orion found me that evening at the tree line. I hadn't planned to be there. I had simply walked until the lodge noise faded and the forest smell replaced it. Pine and cold earth and the faint mineral sharpness of the river somewhere below the ridge. The light was going, the sky turning the deep, uneven blue of early night. The first stars appearing above the canopy in 1s and 2s. I heard him before I saw him. Not footsteps. He moved too quietly for that. More a shift in the air, a change in the density of the silence, the way the forest adjusted its breathing around something large and deliberate moving through it. He came to stand beside me. Not close, a respectful distance, the width of a conversation rather than a confidence. He looked at the tree line the way I was looking at it, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and the evening settled around us like a third presence. Seraphine told me you read the ledger, he said. She also gave me a letter my mother left. A pause. I didn't know about the letter. I know. I could tell. He turned to look at me then, and in the low blue light, his pale eyes were almost silver, and the expression in them was something I hadn't seen on his face before. Not the measured authority, not the recalibration, not the careful choosing of words. Something rawer. Something that had been sitting behind all of those things waiting for an opening. I owe you an explanation, he said. You owe me nothing, I said. You didn't know. Neither did I. That's not the point. His voice had dropped. Not in volume, but in register. Something that made it feel like it was meant for this space rather than the council hall. For 11 days, the pendant was missing. 11 days during which every decision I made felt unmoored. Like navigating without a fixed point. He paused. I didn't understand why until today. I looked at him. Why? He looked back at me steadily. Because the binding isn't meant to function with only one half. The words settled between us with the particular weight of things that are both simple and enormous. the kind of statement that rearranges the air around it when spoken aloud for the first time. I thought about the warmth of the pendant against my ribs. The second heartbeat, calm and steady, for 3 days. I thought about my mother's words. They were never meant to be in opposition. I'm an omega from a dissolved pack, I said, not in argument, but because it felt important to say it plainly, to let it exist in the same sentence as everything else. I know what you are here, he said. That isn't what I'm talking about. The forest was very quiet around us. Above the canopy, the stars were multiplying, cold and clear and indifferent to what happened below them. What do you need from me? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, the careful measuring was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. A wall that had been solid beginning to acknowledge, at least, that it was also a door. I need you to know what you are. The rest comes after that. I looked back at the tree line. The dark between the pines was soft and familiar. I had looked at it for 4 years from my narrow window and found it steadying, because the forest didn't care about hierarchy. I was beginning to understand that maybe I had been reading it wrong. Maybe the forest hadn't been indifferent to me. Maybe it had been waiting. 3 weeks passed before the council challenged it openly. I had expected it sooner. The pack's social architecture was precise and load-bearing. Every role, every rank, every person's placement within the structure served a function, and anything that disrupted the arrangement was felt immediately, the way a building feels a shifted foundation before anyone sees the crack. My new position, undefined as it was, had shifted something. People noticed. People talked. The talking reached the council on a Tuesday morning, carried there by Beta Calder in the form of a formal objection, filed with Old Fen, who was responsible for recording such things, and who had the expression of a man who deeply wished he weren't. I learned about it from Seraphine, who appeared in her workroom doorway while I was cataloging a new shipment of dried herbs and said, in the tone she used for things she found professionally irritating, "The council has called a formal review. They want to examine the binding claim before any status adjustment is considered." She paused. Calder drafted the language himself. It's careful. He knows better than to make it personal. What does the review involve? A demonstration, she said. The pendant, held jointly, in front of the full council and the visiting pack alphas. If the bond responds, if both of you hold it simultaneously and the binding activates, it's documented proof, undeniable, by pack law. I set down the bundle of herbs in my hand. And if it doesn't? She looked at me with the directness she reserved for important things. Then Calder's objection stands, and you return to your previous assignment, and the ledger is classified as inconclusive historical record. A brief pause. But Nora, I have spent 40 years working with binding objects and the wolves who carry them. I have never seen anyone hold that pendant the way you did. It will respond. I appreciated her certainty. I wished some of it would cross the room and settle in my chest, where a cold and insistent doubt had been living since the night at the tree line. Orion came to Seraphine's workroom that evening. He knocked, which Seraphine later told me he had never done before in the 12 years she had been in this pack, because Alpha Kings did not generally knock on doors in their own territory. She said it with the particular satisfaction of someone filing evidence. He sat across the work table from me, and Seraphine found a reason to be elsewhere with impressive speed for a woman of her age, and the room settled into the quiet that had become, over the past weeks, the default atmosphere between us. Not uncomfortable, not easy, but honest in a way that most silences weren't. "You heard about the review," he said. "This morning. Are you afraid?" I considered the question without deflecting it. Of the demonstration failing? No. Of what it means if it doesn't fail? I looked at him. More than I expected to be. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, but recognition. The look of someone hearing their own internal weather described accurately by someone else. "I was 26 when I took the Alpha King's position," he said. It came out without preamble, which was unusual for him. My father had held it for 30 years before me, and he was very good at it, very certain. He never appeared to doubt a decision once it was made. He looked at the pendant where it lay on the table between us, because Seraphine had asked to examine it that afternoon, and he had left it here when he came. I spent the first 3 years waiting to feel certain the way he did. It never came. Eventually, I understood that the certainty I was watching had been performance. A very good performance, by a man who was also underneath it, finding his way through the dark. He picked up the pendant. The silver caught the lamplight, and the carved pattern moved through it in shifting lines. "The bond isn't a diminishment," he said quietly. "That's what I need you to understand before tomorrow. Whatever the council believes, whatever the politics of it become, the original binding was made by two people who understood that strength held alone eventually becomes rigidity. That flexibility requires partnership." He set the pendant down again. My line forgot that. We turned the pendant into a symbol of singular authority, and we lost what it was actually for. I looked at him across the table and thought about my mother's words. They were never meant to be in opposition, and thought about 4 years of making myself invisible, and thought about the steady warmth of the pendant against my ribs for 3 days, and the clarity of those mornings. "I'm still an omega in this pack," I said. "Whatever the binding says, that's still what the structure says." "The structure," he said, "is a thing built by people. It can be rebuilt by people." He met my gaze directly. "If you're willing." The lamp between us burned steadily. Outside the workroom window, the night camp sounds drifted in softly. Voices, a distant fire, the particular quiet rhythm of a large group of people settling toward sleep. My people, by 4 years of proximity, if not by formal belonging. People I had carried firewood for, whose remedies I had mixed, whose names I knew even when they didn't know mine. "Yes," I said. "I'm willing." The morning of the review arrived gray and sharp-edged, a cold front having moved in overnight and stripped the last softness from the autumn air. The full council assembled in the great hall. The visiting pack alphas were there, 6 of them now, a 7th having arrived 2 days prior from the Western Territories, drawn by the news that something unusual was occurring at Greywood. Calder stood at the head of the table with the formal objection document in hand, his expression professionally neutral in the way of someone who has prepared carefully for a confrontation they expect to win. I walked in with Seraphine on my left and Old Fen on my right, and if the 2 of them positioning themselves that way was deliberate, an old healer and a territorial historian flanking the Omega girl as she crossed the council floor, then it was the most quietly eloquent thing I had ever witnessed. Orion was already there, standing at the far end of the table, the pendant in his open palm. Calder read the objection. It was careful, as Seraphine had said, procedurally correct, invoking 3 separate pack laws regarding status claims and binding verification, giving no surface for emotion to grip. The visiting alphas listened. The council listened. I stood in the center of the hall and listened, and kept my breathing even, and did not look at my hands. When Calder finished, Orion spoke. He spoke for 6 minutes. I counted, because focusing on the counting kept everything else manageable. He laid out the history, the ledger, the letter, the archive records, the unbroken secondary bloodline that my mother had documented, and that his own family's archivist had, in one careful act of honesty decades ago, preserved instead of destroyed. He spoke without theater, without the performance of authority, just the flat, clean presentation of evidence by a man who had clearly decided that the most powerful thing he could do in that room was simply tell the truth. Then he held out the pendant toward me. I crossed the floor. The room was very quiet. I was aware of every face, Calder's careful neutrality, Seraphine's steady calm, Old Fen's attentive stillness, the visiting alphas leaning slightly forward with the focused attention of people witnessing something they hadn't expected to see today. I reached out and placed my hand over Orion's, and closed my fingers around the pendant beside his. The warmth was immediate and enormous, not painful, not overwhelming, but total. The way a sound fills a room when it's exactly the right frequency for the space. It moved from the pendant through my palm and up my arm, and spread across my chest. And I felt it meet something there that had always been present but unnamed, the way you feel a wind from a direction you'd stopped expecting. Old Fen made a sound. A quiet sound, but in that silence, it was very clear. The carving on the pendant's face was glowing. A soft amber gold light, subtle but unmistakable, tracing the pattern's lines with the slow, even pulse of something that had been waiting to be completed. Calder looked at it for a long moment. Then he set his objection document face down on the table. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply a man adjusting his position when the ground has demonstrably shifted, and doing it with more grace than I had expected from him. I found, in that moment, something almost like respect for him, for the willingness to let the evidence be the last word. What followed wasn't a ceremony. There was no formal investiture, no public declaration, no moment designed for remembrance. Instead, there was a week of quiet work. Seraphine, Fen, and 2 pack historians pulling every relevant record, cross-referencing the secondary bloodline documentation with pack law, building the legal framework with the careful patience of people who understood that structures built in haste don't hold. I sat with them for hours each day, reading documents I had never had access to before, learning the shape of a history that turned out to have always included me even when it appeared not to. Calder came to Seraphine's workroom on the 4th day. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he said, addressing the room generally rather than anyone in particular, "If you need the training roster adjusted to reflect the new arrangement, I can have it done by morning." Seraphine looked at him over the rim of her reading glasses. "Thank you, Calder. Morning is fine." He nodded and left, and nothing more was said about it by anyone. The visiting alphas departed over the following days, carrying word back to their own territories. I watched the last of their parties leave from the lodge steps on a morning that had turned unexpectedly clear. The sky washed bright after 2 days of rain, the mountains at the edge of the territory showing their snow-covered peaks for the first time that season. Orion came to stand beside me as the last riders disappeared into the tree line. "The southern territories will push back," he said, "when the word reaches them fully. They've been working toward a fractured north for years, and a confirmed binding changes their calculations significantly." "I know," I said. Seraphine briefed me. He looked at me. "You're not afraid of it." I didn't say that. I kept watching the tree line where the riders had gone. I said I know. Knowing and fearing aren't the same thing, and fearing something doesn't mean you can't walk toward it. A pause, then quietly, "No, it doesn't." We stood there for a moment in the cold, clear morning, the pack moving behind us through its daily rhythms. Voices and footsteps, and the distant metallic sound of the training yard. All of it familiar now in a way that had shifted from the familiarity of invisibility to something else, something I was still finding words for. Spring came. The southern pressure came with it. As predicted, 2 formal territorial challenges filed through proper channels, both answered by Greywood's counsel with documentation so thorough that the challenges dissolved without escalating further. Calder handled the correspondence with the focused efficiency of a man who had redirected his considerable capability toward a shared purpose, and who had discovered, perhaps to his own surprise, that he was good at it. Seraphine retired from the full healer's role at midsummer, handing the workroom and its keys and its 30 years of accumulated knowledge to me, with a ceremony that consisted of 1 cup of pine tea and the instruction to trust my own hands, which she had been watching for months and found adequate to the task. She didn't go far, a smaller set of rooms 2 corridors over, where she continued to read and to be consulted, and to offer opinions whether or not they had been requested, which was exactly right. Old Fen outlasted everyone's predictions, as Old Fen had always done, and continued to appear at every council meeting with his ledger, and his quiet attentiveness, and his memory for treaty language that no one else could equal. And Orion, Orion learned slowly, the particular work of carrying something with someone else rather than alone. It didn't come easily to him. He had built himself around singular authority for too many years for the adjustment to be smooth. And there were council meetings that ended with both of us silent on opposite sides of the room, and evenings where the distance between us had the texture of a disagreement that neither of us had finished having yet. But there were also mornings. Mornings in the study with maps spread between us, and 2 cups of something hot, and the quiet back and forth of 2 people building something together with the care that things worth building require. Mornings at the tree line, where the forest had finally revealed itself to me as what it had always been. Not indifferent, not simply a backdrop, but a constant presence, patient and unhurried. The way love is when it has decided to be permanent rather than urgent. The pendant hung on its chain now, not hidden in a pocket, not buried in mud, but present, worn, the carving familiar to my fingers the way important things become familiar. The warmth of it was steady and quiet. A second heartbeat even now. I was 23 when I walked into the great hall with an object I didn't fully understand and placed it on a stone table in front of people who had no category for me. I had been invisible for 4 years, and I had thought, in some deep and barely examined part of myself, that invisibility might be what I was for. I was wrong about that. What I was for turned out to be exactly this. Standing in the middle of my own life with my eyes open and my hands capable and the knowledge, hard-won and unshakable, that last is not the same as least, that quiet is not the same as small, and that the things the world overlooks have a way, patient and inevitable like spring following the coldest winter, of making themselves known. The pack was whole, the binding was sealed, and I was, at last, entirely, irreversibly found.